Mr. Bradley, you have 5 more minutes if you wish. That's the time which we are allotting you because we have a charity to come. And you have very generously offered the inquiry a fuller statement of what you would have wished to say. What you have to say will, of course, be circulated to all core participants for them to see too. So although you're not here necessarily to cover it all because of time, it will be covered, and they may comment on it if they wish in due course. But by all means, please come and hear it.
Many thanks, Sir Brian. I will use my best endeavours to limit myself to the 5 minutes concerned. I'm going to return to the elephant in the room, the pharmaceutical companies. I will provide a full copy of my opening statement that includes details of the batch numbers, the dates upon which patients received the infected product, and the fact that that product caused infections in the United Kingdom to your inquiry. Arising from that particular situation, which is extremely tragic and, as I indicated in Canada, was the subject matter subsequently of a criminal investigation, the Society wishes to ascertain as to whether the inquiry intends to investigate the pharmaceutical companies to the utmost extent of its statutory powers. In that regard, there are powers that are available to this inquiry that can be utilised in the United States, and more particularly a Federal Judicial Assistance Statute, Section 1782, that allows an inquiry or allows an inquiry to seek documentation or what was termed in the United States a foreign international tribunal. That documentation is held in relation to pharmaceutical companies in multi-district litigation depositories. Those litigation depositories resulted from claims that were advanced in the United States, where, as a result of those claims, copies of the discovery documentation was lodged in such depositories. On behalf of my clients, we seek to ascertain as to whether your inquiry will seek access to such documentation available from the depositories and available elsewhere from work that has been undertaken by the Creever Inquiry and indeed the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. I also wish to refer to the issue of Scotland. The Haemophilia Society has many members in Scotland, and we wish to endorse and support the opening statement of Haemophilia Scotland. I don't intend to go into that issue in any further detail here. My clients, the Haemophilia Society, as I indicated, are a charity who have represented people with haemophilia for more than 68 years. As a practitioner who, for a large part of my career, have looked after the interests of people with haemophilia, I have to say I'm struck by the angst that exists within the UK community. In no other jurisdiction in which I've been involved on behalf of people with haemophilia, and I have worked a working knowledge of Canada, the United States, Japan and New Zealand, arising from contamination of blood and blood products, has such a disharmonious situation existed. I believe the significant passage of time that occurred from the date of initial infection to the date of this inquiry, where people were required to exist on subsistence-type payments, has created such anxieties. I would hope, for the sake of the haemophilia community, who I have had the privilege of representing in the past, that those persons will be reconciled and that this public inquiry and your work will assist in that purpose. I note in my own jurisdiction that schemes for compensation have been provided. Life assurance, mortgage protection, travel insurance, and priority in terms of healthcare benefits. That situation has allowed people to achieve some degree of closure. In Ireland, people are entitled, like you, to assessment of their compensation entitlements on a full liability basis where individual assessment is provided. by a specially established compensation tribunal pursuant to statute. A further extension of that scheme, our statute scheme, occurred in 2006 and provided the mortgage protection, life assurance and travel insurance. Priority healthcare exists. People have a card that allows them to get priority because the system injured them. In contrast, in the United Kingdom, people in identical circumstances who have suffered equal injustice have been left to die in poverty, without dignity, and without knowing why they were infected or dying. That is wrong. That needs to be addressed. My clients say to government, and indeed to previous governments, they have said it, you ought to hang your head in shame for failing your own vulnerable citizens and our members in their greatest hour of need. The Society believes that you have the power, Mr. Chairperson, to make interim recommendations, and that it is now necessary for this inquiry to make interim recommendations to alleviate basic financial hardship and to commence the process of addressing compensation and ensure the provision of healthcare entitlements. Nothing less is adequate. Delays are no longer tolerable. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bradley. We now have the opening statement by Samantha May on behalf of the Hepatitis C Trust.
The Hepatitis C Trust is the only dedicated UK charity for people affected by hepatitis C. The majority of us, myself included, have had hepatitis C ourselves. We were formed over 17 years ago because a group of patients, led by our former CEO, Charles Gore, were outraged at the lack of support, information and representation for people with Hep C and wanted to make it better for others. Over the years, we have expanded beyond those core aims and now also provide a wide range of services and projects run by staff and volunteers to raise awareness and to support vulnerable groups to get tested and treated, whilst always ensuring that Hep C stays firmly on the government's and policymakers' agenda. All of this contributing towards helping things to be better for everyone with this illness, and getting the undiagnosed diagnosed in whatever ways we can. This is in line with our ultimate goal of eliminating Hep C in the UK by 2030. My role at the Trust for the best part of 15 years has been specifically to provide a national helpline for people infected and affected by hepatitis C. We also provide information to the general public, employers, medics, drug services and more, and have taken more than 42,000 calls. Of those, around 4,000 contacts have been specifically from those who have been infected, affected or had concerns about blood and blood products. We know that there are thousands of people no longer with us who should have been here to have their voice heard in this inquiry, and many more who are simply too ill to take part now that it is finally underway. And from what we have heard over the years, there are many more who have died, who were never diagnosed, and so therefore cannot be included. I would like to take this opportunity to pay a personal tribute and give a voice to just one of them. Annie Walker from Norwich, who did so much to help me when I was first diagnosed back in 2002, just 6 months after she had been diagnosed herself, although I didn't know that at the time. She already seemed like an old hand at it all. Knowing I was not alone and that I could talk freely to someone meant so much to me at the time. Annie received infected blood aged 19 and later endured several difficult treatments over the years, but still had to undergo a liver transplant as a result of the liver damage that the Hep C had caused. Unfortunately, she still went on to develop cancer after that and died in early 2016, aged 62. She did so much to support people, and despite her very difficult personal situation, had always campaigned long and hard, specifically on infected blood issues and GP awareness, right until the end. But despite her anger and frustration with it all, she managed all of that with intelligence, kindness and humour. It is a great shame that she was not here today to see the day of this inquiry finally arrive, so she could have her say. The last news she heard on the subject was the government's apology in March 2015. A close friend was with her at the time and said he will never forget the look of disappointment on her face. What she wanted was not an apology, but justice for everyone that had been affected. Being diagnosed with any serious, potentially life-threatening illness is devastating. What we have heard from our callers is that it feels like life stops when they hear their diagnosis. Fears about how long they will have to live, how it will affect them and the people they care about. Worries about transmission to others, tests, treatments, operations and possible death is overwhelming. And the majority of those just diagnosed with Hep C will have no idea what it is, or even if they do a little bit, they often get it confused with other illnesses. Unfortunately, often the person diagnosing them doesn't know much about it either. Most people are given no information, or possibly worse, misinformation. They are sometimes treated judgmentally. Personal questions are asked about their lifestyle and how they could have got it. And although there are many ways that blood-to-blood transmission can occur, the suspicion will often be that it was due to intravenous drug use. This is, of course, a very high-risk route of transmission, but it is not the only one. And those infected with Hep C alone are often told, wrongly, except in very particular circumstances, that it is sexually transmitted and that there's an urgent need for their partner to be tested. And because that information is often relayed by a doctor, they believe it, and that mistaken belief will often greatly affect their personal relationships. Then, most likely, much later after their diagnosis, those who have received infected blood and blood products on the NHS will discover that in fact it could perhaps have been avoided entirely, or if it couldn't, that they should have at least found out about it a whole lot sooner before the possibility of serious consequences from it arose. When we talk to people and hear their stories, we can take the time to ask pertinent questions. It is very often sad that as they start to reflect that over the years, often decades, they've perhaps only been half the person they could have been and should have been. Because all those vague and often intermittent early symptoms they've been experiencing, feeling run down, digestive problems, brain fog, general aches and pains, low mood, depression, poor sleep, too much sleep, meant that they were misdiagnosed with a whole bunch of other things or labelled a hypochondriac. But they had actually been having that go on for so long, they thought it was simply just the way they were. Busy, stressful lives, working too much, getting older, menopause, other health conditions. But all that could have been avoided, or at least made somewhat better, if only they and their doctors had known they were at risk of receiving infected blood, and they had been offered a test decades ago. Unfortunately for many, finding out too late left people with perhaps no option for treatment or lifestyle changes to slow down or prevent the devastating potential problems having hepatitis C can cause, along with all the other illnesses it can make them more prone to developing. And they could have had the chance to take steps to reduce the possibility, however small, of onward transmission. As if all this isn't enough to deal with, some of them may then find out a few months later, after their initial diagnosis, after more tests, more waiting, more results, and probably more confusing info, that aside from hepatitis C, they have also developed cirrhosis or possibly even liver cancer. And of course, there's not a single one of us who has lived with this illness who has not felt the absolute terror that they may have given it to someone else inadvertently during the time they were undiagnosed. They may start to tell people about it, if indeed they're brave enough, as so many people feel so stigmatised, they are simply too frightened to talk to others. Then they realise that maybe some people at least start to look at them a bit differently, or stop seeing them so often, or don't let their kids come over to stay, or eat at their house again. Dentists or medics may treat them differently. Their employer may overreact and panic about potential but unfounded threats to the safety of their fellow staff or customers. They may get sacked, or their contract is not renewed, or they get put totally unnecessarily onto other duties. Sometimes even their own family turns their back on them and takes their kids away with them, all due to ignorance about transmission. At some point, hopefully, but not always, as many people are unaware of this, they find out that they are eligible to claim for financial assistance from the government that has been made available to help support them because of the effects of this illness and the older treatments for it. And so they try to find the records to support their claim, an onerous task at a time when they are already feeling greatly affected by this illness. Many don't feel they can go ahead and claim for this reason, and we have also spoken to some who are simply too ashamed to even contemplate claiming. But if they do go ahead, they're likely to find they're not there. They've been routinely destroyed, they're incomplete, there's some before they received blood or blood products, and some after, but not for then. Sorry. The hospital's closed, been burnt down, they're lost. Or maybe there weren't even notes there in the first place. Or has something else happened to them? And because it's usually taken 10, 20, 30, 40 or even more years to diagnose them, all of these things are much more likely to have happened. So then they find they're not actually going to be eligible for that help anyway. At the Trust, we do all that we can to properly inform, support, advocate and help everyone to navigate all these problems, and many others. The inquiry team has already started to hear personal stories from people across the UK in preparation for the start of this inquiry. We have been hearing them continually, week in and week out, since we started. As a core participant, we look forward to working closely with the inquiry team to see how best we can support them, and will make sure all the issues we have heard about from our callers are represented during the course of this inquiry. They are typically people who are over 50, 60, 70 and even a few over 80s, many of whom are just getting diagnosed now. And perhaps naturally, they think it is something they must have caught relatively recently. But often when we start to talk to them, it becomes obvious that the most likely course of infection for many of them is receiving blood or blood products following accidents, during operations, childbirth, or for specific health conditions many decades ago, going back to the late 60s. At last, for all the groups represented in this inquiry is an opportunity for all the evidence given by everyone affected to provide a roadmap to the answers for the many questions people have been campaigning about over the last 3 decades. Explanations of what happened, acknowledgement of what went wrong, accountability, and we very much hope that it will provide some sort of justice, closure and healing by finally giving the proper and undivided attention and exploration that all of the questions that have been raised in the terms of reference by the people directly affected so rightly deserve. And we would fully expect that the learning that comes from this inquiry will help to inform and prevent any similar tragedy from occurring in the future. And lastly, we very much hope during the inquiry that the public profile of this illness is raised, and that anyone who has potentially been at risk of Hep C from infected blood on the NHS before September 1991 goes and gets tested, and also that a concerted effort is made to find them. Because if all the people who have been at risk of Hep C can be identified quickly, with the new oral treatments that are available that have a success rate of over 97%, then they can be spared from these many and varied problems that this illness causes. And most importantly, perhaps their lives can be saved. Thank you.
Thank you to the Hepatitis C Trust. The next opening statement is from the Department of Health, Eleanor Grey, Queen's Counsel. I ask you to listen to her with the same respect that you have shown to all other speakers.
Sir Brian, thank you for this opportunity to address this inquiry, its core participants and all those affected by its important and sensitive work. As you know, I represent the Department of Health and Social Care, as it is now called, and its predecessors over the years that your inquiry will be examining. Can I say on the Department's behalf, at the very beginning of these short remarks, that we welcome this public inquiry and that we are committed to cooperating with it and assisting it to the best of our ability to fulfil its terms of reference, every aspect of them. The Prime Minister, when she first announced the establishment of an inquiry back in 2017, spoke of an appalling tragedy which should never have happened. Your sponsoring minister, Mr. Lidington, later stated that the infected blood scandal of the 1970s and 80s is a tragedy that should never have happened. Now, those are words from government ministers. However sincere they are, they cannot convey or comprehend the full knowledge and experience of those directly affected by the events that you are charged with investigating. But on behalf of my clients, I do say that those words, the acceptance that this should not have happened, is an acceptance that things went wrong. Things happened that should not have happened, and so, on behalf of my clients, I say unreservedly that we are sorry. We are sorry that this should be so, that this happened when it should not have done. This is the beginning of a journey to uncover exactly what happened and why, but from those I represent, it begins with an expression of sorrow and regret. Sir Brian, over the last 2.5 days, we have listened and we have heard the powerful and moving voices of some of those who have actually lived through tragedy, have experienced infection and its devastating effects upon their families and loved ones, the infected and the affected, to use the language of your counsel to the inquiry. Together with those in this hall, I and members of the team from the Department of Health and Social Care have heard individuals and their representatives speak of the truly horrendous wrongs that have been visited upon us, to use the words of one of the core participants who spoke yesterday. We will continue to listen and to reflect upon those experiences as you fulfill your promises to put the infected and the affected at the heart of this inquiry. We will convey back to those I represent the words, the emotions, and the aspirations for this inquiry of those who have been heard in this hearing room. Now, we have heard many points, not only about what has happened, but about continuing or current steps that are needed, and we will reflect upon them as your work continues. The establishment of this inquiry and the approval by the Cabinet Office of its wide terms of reference represents a commitment. It's a commitment to ensuring that those infected and those affected are given full and truthful answers to questions that they have been asking for decades. It is a commitment to investigating and making findings upon issues of responsibility, individual responsibilities, as well as organisational and systemic failures. It's a commitment to seeking to ensure that something similar never happens again. And so I should say this clearly: those I represent understand and will seek to support this inquiry in achieving those objectives. I'll come back to that, but first can I just briefly return to the subject of who I represent. I mentioned the Department of Health and Social Care and its predecessor bodies. That includes, for present purposes, the representation of those organisations or bodies for which the department was responsible over the years, such as the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency, or MHRA, as well as individuals who worked for them. Now, you, sir, will appreciate that the formulation I've just given is somewhat broad, perhaps even ill-defined at the moment. The breadth of the department's responsibilities has altered over the years, and that's reflected in the fact that the Welsh and Northern Ireland governments have separate representation before you, for example, while some NHS bodies, regional health authorities, for example, no longer exist. But what we wish to ensure is that there are no gaps in the coverage and reach of this inquiry. In particular, we are committed to assisting you in ensuring that the inquiry has full knowledge of and can exercise its statutory rights of access to all relevant repositories of documents and can gather further written and oral evidence from those who are able and available to assist you. So we will look at those who we represent and whether there are any gaps in coverage as the inquiry progresses and take action as needed. The inquiry is, of course, independent of government, including of the Department of Health and Social Care. As core participants, we therefore stand on an equal footing with other core participants. So, Brian, it would be foolish of me to ignore or not to mention the fact that many of those who have suffered contamination with infected blood or blood products, their affected families and friends, do not trust the Department of Health or individuals who have worked in it over the years. There have been eloquent statements about breaches of trust experienced, as well as many reminders of what may, at worst, have been a cover-up, or at best, a lack of candour about past events. There's been repeated mention of the destruction of documents, both government papers and medical records. Now, standing here today, I do not seek to comment upon or to respond to those statements or to that legacy of distress and distrust. That will be a process over the months that follows these hearings as your inquiry investigates these matters. But 2 points, if I may, in response to the fears or the distrust which has been expressed of those whom I represent. And my 2 points are about the conduct of this inquiry. First, as I've already said, of course, you and your team are, of course, independent, with no links to any particular actors or interest groups in this long-running tragedy, and you will act, we know, with scrupulous impartiality in conducting your investigation into these matters. You've already made that quite clear in your own opening address to its core participants and all those who attended the inquiry on Monday. But secondly, sir, as I've stated, we are committed to assisting you to fulfilling the terms of reference in all their breadth, including, for example, your investigation of the issues of candour, openness and cover-up. It will be the task of my legal team, as well as those who are supporting it behind the scenes, to ensure that our actions reflect that commitment. We wish to ensure that, with time and with experience, this commitment cannot be dismissed as mere empty words, but can be seen to have been demonstrated in the engagement and in the learning of the Department of Health and Social Care and its staff and its representatives in this inquiry. And you and your team, Sir Brian, are entitled to look to us to fulfil that promise over the coming months. Now, I am sure that at times this process will not be straightforward, and there will be differences of perspectives and diverging views, strongly held views, between core participants. One of the roles of any core participant and its legal team, if it has one, is to show the inquiry how issues were perceived by those participants at the relevant time, in the light of the information which was known at the time. And that, of course, includes enabling reflection on what could have been known with fuller inquiry or what ought to have been known. But perspectives about what was said or done in the past or what is submitted about it now are likely to differ, even to collide. But the important point here today, however, is the commitment of the team which I represent, together with our clients, to ensuring that the fullest possible picture is laid before you so that you can make findings upon it. Now, this, we believe, is necessary. It comes from our obligations to you as the chair of a public inquiry with full statutory powers. But just as important, it is also right. Right because it's the way to ensure that you can meet your terms of reference. Right because it will enable you to give the infected and those affected the answers that they have been looking for. And right because there's an important public interest in the recommendations that you are empowered to make and in seeking to prevent future similar tragedies. Now, Sir Brian, you will have heard it said, no doubt, even in the midst of appalling NHS treatment errors and mistakes, that the professionals involved did not intentionally seek to harm their patients, or that a very small minority, a tiny proportion of health professionals are motivated by a desire to treat and to help. Equally, although it may not be universally accepted, and speaking very generally, one of the motivations of those working for government, in government, is public service. Now, this inquiry will put a mirror before many professional and government figures, and that mirror may reflect uncomfortable truths. With the assistance of core participants, we know that the inquiry will explore the gap between those witnesses' aspirations or motivations and the reality of what happened to and what was experienced by the infected and the affected. But I would ask for an appreciation of the fact that confronting and acknowledging these gaps or realities will be a difficult and painful experience for many witnesses. That is not a complaint. It is right and proper that it should take place. And nor am I seeking to make any comparison with the suffering of those affected or infected, which is on a different plane completely. But we would look to the inquiry to create, by its conduct and its procedures, a space which enables learning and reflection by those it seeks to call to account. Sir, I do not use the word safe space. Public inquiries are not safe or cosy places, and nor should they be, but a space to allow candid reflection. And I would hope that this objective of enabling learning and reflection through the conduct of this inquiry will be shared by all core participants, and that there will be cooperation in achieving this. Now, over the summer, as you'll know, we've been working on preliminary disclosure or information requests from the inquiry, and to date, we've delivered several thousand documents, but plainly that is a mere beginning. We're committed to working with the inquiry's own team and its representatives on the disclosure of documents to ensure that there can be no questions or doubt about the completeness or the integrity of the documents supplied. We know that the inquiry wants to see as fast a pace of delivery as is reasonably possible, and that it wishes to see that the Department keeps pace with the inquiry's requests. And the Department is forming a dedicated team to deliver those commitments. We look forward to working with you and your inquiry team to deliver the disclosure that is required and to facilitating the participation by those from whom the inquiry wishes to hear, whether by statements or in person. And this will require, of course, as you would expect, a full review of documents held. Recently, you, Sir Brian, published a statement of intent upon the approach to disclosure and legal professional privilege. And you reminded bodies, such as those I represent, of the need to give careful consideration to the issue of waiving legal professional privilege in relation to past documents and events. My clients will indeed do so, considering whether it is in the public interest to waive any such claims in the context of this vital inquiry. Sir, may I conclude by repeating the commitment of my clients, the Department of Health and Social Care, as well as the MHRA, to participating in your review as fully as possible, so as to enable you to fulfil your terms of reference both as rigorously and as expeditiously as possible. We wish to work with the inquiry to ensure that all those affected by its important work will conclude, as a result of that work and your findings, that justice has been secured. Thank you very much.
There's a pair of glasses there to be collected at tea time. Glasses case, I should say. We will take tea after the next two presentations and before Mr. Corey Wright QC gives his address to you. But the next statement is from Alphy Maginness on behalf of organisations in Northern Ireland.
Thank you, Chairman. Good afternoon. Sir Brian, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I can confirm I represent 4 bodies from Northern Ireland: the Department of Health in Northern Ireland, the Regional Health and Social Care Board, the Northern Ireland Blood Transfusion Service, and the Belfast Health and Social Care Trust. And on behalf of those 4 bodies, I can't say we welcome the establishment of this inquiry and its extensive terms of reference. We too are conscious of the tragedies and the life-changing impacts that have resulted from the use of contaminated blood and blood products. The people who have been infected or otherwise affected are entitled to know all those facts that can be established and to have the truth as soon as it can be delivered. We hope that the inquiry will be able to proceed expeditiously to its conclusion, appreciating, of course, that it must be afforded sufficient time to consider fully and thoroughly the vast volume of evidence that it will receive. 3 of these 4 bodies are core participants to this inquiry, and I wish to explain briefly the function and role of each. Firstly, the Department of Health has overall responsibility for the provision of health and social care in Northern Ireland. All health and social care bodies are accountable to the Department. The Permanent Secretary at the Department is also the Chief Executive of Health and Social Care in Northern Ireland. The Regional Health and Social Care Board was established in April 2009 by the Northern Ireland Health and Social Care Reform Act, also of 2009. It is the successor of the Eastern Health and Social Services Board, which had operated from its establishment in 1972. That Eastern Board had management responsibility for the blood transfusion service in Northern Ireland from 1972 until April 1994. It was also responsible for haematology services within the local management area. The Northern Ireland Blood Transfusion Service was established as a special agency in April 1994. As its title suggests, it has been responsible since then for the collection, testing and distribution to hospital blood banks of blood and blood products for the region. The inquiry will have received the agency's response to the Rule 9 request on the 21st of September, last Friday, confirming that work has commenced to locate, retrieve and catalogue information for the inquiry. Additional staffing has also been put in place to complete this work. The Belfast Health and Social Care Trust has applied for core participant status. It was established in April 2007 following a restructuring of health and social care in Northern Ireland. It retains responsibility for the Northern Ireland Haemophilia Centre at Belfast City Hospital and the Children's Haematology Unit at the Royal Belfast Hospital for Sick Children. It also has responsibility for the Regional Hepatology Service and the HIV Service for those affected secondary to transfusion of blood and its components. The Trust has also been in correspondence with the inquiry and confirmed its commitment to supporting the inquiry in an open and transparent manner. Sir Brian, I can also confirm that each organisation is endeavouring to identify and collate relevant documents and records for the benefit of the inquiry. I can also reassure you that the relevant documents and records will be preserved for the duration of the inquiry, and indeed at your request, Sir Brian, the Permanent Secretary has written to all health and social care organisations, reminding them of the requirement to preserve documents and to waive any fees that may normally be charged for access to medical records in the case of infected and affected people who request such access for the purpose of providing evidence to this inquiry. One cannot fail, sir, to be moved by the stories of courage, fortitude, dignity and perseverance that we have heard over the last few days from those infected or affected. The core participants in Northern Ireland are fully aware of the terms of reference for the inquiry, which are extensive and cover a lengthy period, in particular since 1970. I can confirm to you, sir, the inquiry can expect the full cooperation of those core participants, and we look forward to further engagement with the inquiry and the inquiry team. That concludes the opening comments from the Northern Ireland core participants.
There is an opening statement from the Welsh Health Service to be read by Junior Counsel to the Inquiry, Katie Scott.
My name is Katie Scott. I'm one of the junior counsels to the inquiry, and I have a written statement by Vaughan Gething, the Cabinet Secretary for Health and Social Services from the Welsh Government. Having met and spent time with the individuals and families of those affected in Wales, their strength of feeling in favour of a UK-wide public inquiry into the circumstances surrounding their treatment with contaminated blood became apparent. The families seek closure and clarity about what has happened to them. I am pleased that their call for such action has been listened to and that the inquiry is now starting. Sir Brian Langstaff has listened to the views from Wales, either through the consultation responses or in person by meeting those affected, their families, Haemophilia Wales and our cross-party group at the Welsh Assembly. I am content with the proposed terms of reference for the inquiry, as these reflect the thoughts and wishes of people directly affected and the wider stakeholders that I and my officials have previously met. I also support Sir Brian's proposal to establish expert groups to assist the inquiry in gathering its evidence. My officials will continue to support the inquiry team as this important work gathers pace to ensure that the voices of those affected in Wales are heard and the survivors and their families feel assured that the inquiry will take account of their evidence and provide answers to their questions and concerns. I look forward to receiving regular updates from the inquiry team.
As promised, there will now be a 20-minute break.